Miss Marple and the Shadow on the Attic Window. Chapter 1. The Uneasy Arrival. The village of Greystone had always been described as a quiet, almost drowsy place, a scattering of cottages with thatched roofs, roses climbing over stone walls, and narrow lanes where horse-carts still rattled from time to time. It was the sort of place where secrets should have been impossible, where neighbors peered over hedges and news spread faster than the church bell could toll. And yet, as Miss Jane Marple soon discovered, even the most peaceful of villages could harbor shadows, sometimes quite literally. It was early evening when Miss Marple's carriage pulled up before the modest but handsome home of her old acquaintance, Mrs. Elspeth Harding. The two women had known each other in their youth, meeting again occasionally through the years, always with warm recollections and promises to stay in touch. When Mrs. Harding had written to invite Miss Marple to Greystone for a short stay, "A little change of scene and fresh country air will do wonders, dear Jane," the elderly sleuth had agreed. St. Mary Mead, after all, could grow monotonous, and Miss Marple never disliked observing the curious rhythms of a new village. The Harding residence stood along a narrow lane known locally as Hawthorne Row. Across from it, looming slightly larger and more somber, was the Whitcomb House, a three-story building whose shutters were closed tight as though keeping watch against the world. Its uppermost floor jutted awkwardly beneath steep gables, and the attic window, Miss Marple noted immediately, seemed to catch the fading light in a peculiar way, reflecting it, then swallowing it whole. Her hostess greeted her with warmth and bustle, urging the maid to bring tea, taking Miss Marple's small valise, and fussing over whether the journey had been tiring. "Not at all, Elspeth," Miss Marple assured her, though privately she thought the train connections had been particularly inconvenient. Still, it was pleasant to hear birdsong instead of the clatter of St. Mary Mead's High Street. Once her tea had been poured and her bonnet set aside, Mrs. Harding ushered Miss Marple upstairs to the guest room. It was a cheerful enough chamber, with a broad bedstead and a little writing desk near the window. From here, however, the view gave directly onto the Whitcomb House. And as Miss Marple set her spectacles upon her nose to peer more closely, she thought she saw, just for an instant, a movement at the attic window. A faint flicker of shadow. A figure. Or merely the play of light and clouds. She blinked, looked again, but the window was still now, pale and vacant. Perhaps it was only her imagination, sharpened by fatigue from travel. "Your room comfortable, Jane?" Mrs. Harding asked, plumping a pillow. "Oh, perfectly so," Miss Marple replied mildly, though her eyes lingered a moment longer upon that attic window. The sense of unease clung to her, faint but insistent, like the scent of lavender that never quite leaves a pressed handkerchief. Supper that evening was pleasant enough. Roast lamb, new potatoes, and stewed apples. Mrs. Harding's son, George, a solicitor by profession, joined them, though he spoke distractedly about some matter in the county court. Conversation turned, as it often did in such circles, to the affairs of neighbors. "That great hulking place opposite," Mrs. Harding remarked, nodding toward the Whitcomb House. "It has such an air of gloom, don't you think? Poor Mrs. Whitcomb rattles about in it alone these days, except for her maid. She refuses to sell or even to let it, though goodness knows she could never need so many rooms." "She is elderly, perhaps?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Elderly, yes, but more than that, odd," George Harding put in, carving his lamb. "Her husband died under rather peculiar circumstances some 20 years ago. Nothing scandalous officially, but people still whisper. And there was a son who, well, vanished abroad, they say. Never came back." Mrs. Harding gave her son a reproving glance. "George, really, you'll alarm Jane." But Miss Marple only smiled her quiet smile. "Villages are much alike, my dear. I assure you, I am not easily alarmed. In St. Mary Mead we have no shortage of whispering tongues." Nevertheless, as they spoke, Miss Marple could not help glancing again toward the Whitcomb House. From the dining-room window, one had a clear view of the upper floor across the way. And just as she turned her head, she thought once more she caught the faint suggestion of movement, a shadow passing across the attic window, though no lamp was lit within. She said nothing, merely spooned a little stewed apple onto her plate. But she was thinking. And Miss Marple's thoughts, when quietly set in motion, were not easily stilled. Later that night, after retiring with a hot water bottle and a well-worn copy of Milton, Miss Marple stood once more by her guest-room window. The village lay hushed beneath a silver wash of moonlight. The hedges were black outlines, the trees scarcely stirred. The Whitcomb house loomed solemn and silent. And there, faintly, unmistakably this time, something shifted in the attic window. A dark outline like the passing of a figure. It lingered only a heartbeat before vanishing again. Miss Marple, though her heart beat somewhat faster, did not gasp or cry out. She merely folded her hands over the sill, her mind whirring with quiet certainty. An attic long said to be locked, a house half abandoned, a widow shunning company, and now a shadow on the window. It was the beginning, she suspected, of one of those puzzles life occasionally presented her. And Jane Marple, who had seen more wickedness beneath lace curtains and teapots than most Scotland Yard inspectors, knew well that shadows rarely appeared without substance. She turned back toward her bed, extinguished the lamp, and thought calmly, "Tomorrow I must make a few discreet inquiries." Chapter 2. The Attic That Should Be Empty. The next morning dawned bright and brisk, the air carrying that particular freshness one only finds in villages where hedgerows stretch unbroken for miles. Miss Marple, who was always an early riser, came down to breakfast with her knitting already in hand. Mrs. Harding, bustling with cheerful efficiency, provided eggs, toast, and marmalade. George had gone early to his office in the county town. "You'll find Greystone most restful, Jane," Mrs. Harding remarked as she poured out tea. "Nothing ever happens here, except perhaps a cow straying onto the vicar's lawn, or a dispute over flower arrangements in the church." Miss Marple smiled politely. It was a remark she had heard before, in many a village. In her experience, such assurances usually preceded the most curious revelations. After breakfast, she strolled down the lane. The morning sun painted every rose bush and ivy wall in crisp relief. Yet her eyes kept straying toward the Whitcomb house. In daylight, the place looked even more forbidding. Its shutters sagged at odd angles, the paint on its doors peeled, and the tall chimneys gave it the appearance of a grim sentinel watching over the lane. Miss Marple paused before it under the pretense of adjusting her glove. The attic window glared down upon her, blank and expressionless now. But she remembered too clearly the shadow she had seen in its depths the night before. As she stood, a man approached from the gate, a stooped figure in a gardener's coat, cap pulled low. He gave her a polite nod. "Good morning," Miss Marple said sweetly. "You must be connected with this house?" "Aye, ma'am," he replied. His accent was thick with local burr. "Name's Cribbins. I see to the grounds, such as they are." "A very fine old place," Miss Marple observed, peering up again. "Though it must be a great burden for Mrs. Whitcomb, keeping it in order." The man gave a snort. "A burden indeed. Half the rooms ain't opened these 20 years. The attic, for one. Locked tight since before the war." "Really?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but she gave him a shrewd glance. "That seems unusual. No one ever goes up there." Cribbins shook his head. "Dust thick as a rug up there, I reckon. Mrs. Whitcomb don't like it mentioned. Says it's unhealthy, drafty, no good for anyone. And the maid, Clara, she won't go near it. Superstitious, she is." Miss Marple gave a soft laugh. "Ah, but one does hear stories about attics. Old houses seem to collect more than trunks and cobwebs in their upper rooms, don't they?" The gardener gave her a queer look, as though not sure whether she jested. "All I know, ma'am, is that no one's set foot there in years. It's empty. Empty." The word seemed to linger in the air, oddly discordant with Miss Marple's memory of the shadow passing across that very window. She nodded politely, thanked the man, and went on her way. But in her mind, threads were beginning to weave themselves together into one of those subtle patterns she knew so well. That afternoon, Mrs. Harding suggested they call upon Mrs. Whitcomb. "She lives so near, Jane, it would be only polite. Though I warn you, she is not the most gracious of hostesses." The Whitcomb house seemed colder within than without. The maid Clara, a pale girl with anxious eyes, led them into a dimly lit drawing room where heavy drapes shut out much of the daylight. The furniture was grand but faded, smelling faintly of dust and mothballs. Mrs. Whitcomb herself entered after a delay. She was tall, with sharp cheekbones and a severe hairstyle that had perhaps not changed in decades. Her eyes, though clouded with age, held a peculiar sharpness, like a cat's that misses nothing. "Elspeth," she said in a voice that was both weary and guarded. "And this must be your guest." "Jane Marple," Miss Marple said pleasantly. The conversation that followed was stilted. Mrs. Harding made polite remarks about the weather, the state of the churchyard, and the coming harvest festival. Mrs. Whitcomb replied with clipped sentences, as though each word cost her an effort. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat serenely knitting, offering a gentle comment here and there, all the while observing. At one point, as the tea was poured, Miss Marple remarked, "Your house must hold many memories, Mrs. Whitcomb. I suppose the upper floors are seldom used now." The widow's hand jerked slightly, spilling a few drops of tea upon the saucer. Her eyes flickered, just for an instant, toward the ceiling. Then she smiled thinly. "Quite so. The attic especially. Shut away, useless, full of dust. I cannot abide attics." Clara, the maid, who was standing by with the teapot, turned visibly pale at these words. Miss Marple did not fail to notice. Nor did she miss the way Mrs. Whitcomb's fingers trembled slightly before setting her cup down. When they took their leave, Mrs. Harding sighed with relief once the door had closed behind them. "I did warn you, Jane. She's quite impossible, really. So stiff and secretive." "Indeed," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, glancing up at the attic window once more as they stepped into the lane. The sun was setting now, and the glass reflected the dying light in a way that almost seemed like eyes watching them depart. She said nothing of the gardener's insistence that the attic was empty, nor of Mrs. Whitcomb's sudden nervousness. But her needles clicked faster that evening as she knitted by the fire, her mind working in its quiet, inexorable fashion. For Jane Marple knew this much. In villages, as in life, it was precisely those places declared empty and forgotten that most often concealed the greatest secrets. And that shadow on the attic window was no trick of light. Chapter 3. The Widow's House. The next morning, the village air seemed charged with an expectant stillness, as though Greystone itself held its breath. The Whitcomb house loomed across Hawthorne Row, grim and silent under a grey sky. Its attic window stared blankly toward Miss Marple's guest room, and she, knitting in her chair by the window, could not resist glancing up at it every few moments. Her needles clicked, her wool unwound, yet her thoughts returned again and again to that shadow she had seen. 2 nights now it had flitted across the glass. And yet, both the gardener and the widow herself had insisted the attic was locked and long unused. The contradiction intrigued her. In Miss Marple's experience, contradictions were often the first loose threads that, when tugged gently, unraveled the whole fabric of a mystery. That afternoon, Mrs. Harding excused herself to visit a neighbor who was ill, and Miss Marple, never one to waste an opportunity, announced her intention of calling again on Mrs. Whitcomb. "It is always best to be civil," she said with her usual mildness, "and I think she struck me as rather lonely." Mrs. Harding raised her eyebrows. "Lonely, perhaps. But she has made a virtue of her solitude. I wish you luck, Jane." The Whitcomb house greeted her with its usual gloom. Clara, the maid, admitted her reluctantly. The girl's hands twisted nervously at her apron, and her eyes darted toward the staircase as though fearful of being overheard. "Is Mrs. Whitcomb at home?" Miss Marple asked kindly. "Yes, ma'am. In the drawing room." The widow received her guest without enthusiasm, though she did not appear surprised. She was seated in a high-backed chair near the cold fireplace, a shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders despite the mildness of the day. "Miss Marple," she said, inclining her head, "I had not expected you again so soon." "I do hope you will forgive the intrusion," Miss Marple replied gently, settling herself in a nearby chair. "But I could not resist the pleasure of another visit. Old houses and their histories fascinate me, and yours is such a fine example." Mrs. Whitcomb's thin lips pressed together. "It is a house, nothing more. I keep it because it has always been ours. My late husband was born here, and I have no wish to live elsewhere." Her tone was defensive, almost brittle. Miss Marple, however, merely nodded. "And you are quite alone now. Except for Clara, of course." The widow's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Quite alone. My son is gone. My husband. She broke off, then gave a small, sharp laugh. But such things are of no concern to visitors. Oh, but you are mistaken, Miss Marple said softly, her needles clicking as she resumed her knitting. The lives of our neighbors are of concern to us all. Why, in St. Mary Mead, I can assure you, no one so much as changes a maid without the entire village knowing within hours. Mrs. Whitcomb did not smile. Her gaze strayed toward the staircase, and for an instant her mask slipped. There was something in her eyes, fear, perhaps, or guilt, that flickered like the shadow on the attic window. Miss Marple caught it, tucked it away in her mind, and went on chatting in her pleasant, rambling fashion. About roses, about the vicar's sermon, about how difficult it was to find good wool these days. She had long ago discovered that people revealed far more when they thought no one was truly listening. And indeed, by the time she rose to take her leave, she had gleaned several small details. Mrs. Whitcomb never spoke her husband's name aloud. She avoided any mention of her son. And whenever the attic creaked with the ordinary groans of an old house, her fingers clenched tighter on her shawl. As Miss Marple stepped back into the lane, she met Clara again, carrying a basket of laundry toward the line at the side of the house. The girl looked pale, her eyes downcast. A great many sheets for one household, Miss Marple observed conversationally. Clara startled, then forced a smile. Yes, ma'am. Miss Marple lowered her voice. You work very hard here, my dear. It must be lonely for you as well. The girl hesitated, her lip trembling. Then she blurted in a whisper, I don't like it in this house, ma'am. Not at night. There are noises. Noises. Clara glanced up toward the attic window, then looked away quickly. Scraping sometimes. Footsteps. I told myself it's just the wind or rats. But I know it isn't. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand upon the girl's arm. You are wise to trust your instincts, my dear. Houses, like people, keep secrets. But secrets have a way of pressing upon those who live among them. The maid looked as though she wished to say more, but at that moment a sharp voice rang out from the house. Clara. Mrs. Whitcomb stood framed in the doorway, her eyes hard. Clara flushed, bobbed a curtsy, and hurried inside without another word. Miss Marple lingered only a moment longer, glancing once more at the attic window. For the briefest instant, she fancied she saw movement there again, a flicker against the glass, as though someone within had drawn back from watching her. Then the window was still. Miss Marple turned and made her way back to the Harding home, her knitting needles clutched firmly in her bag. She had more than enough to consider. That evening, as Mrs. Harding served tea by the fire, Miss Marple remarked in her mild way, It is curious how houses seem to take on the characters of those who dwell in them. The Whitcomb house, for example. It has the air of something shut up tight, as though hiding not only dust but memories best left untouched. Mrs. Harding gave a little shiver. I've always felt the same. It gives me the creeps, truth be told. But what else can one expect from a family like the Whitcombs? I dare say you'll hear the whole story soon enough. Villages never forget. And Miss Marple, sipping her tea, thought quietly that she had already heard enough to suspect that the story was far from finished. For if the attic was truly locked, and if Mrs. Whitcomb was truly alone, then whose shadow had crossed that window? Chapter 4, An Interrupted Supper. The following evening found Miss Marple once again seated at the Harding dinner table. Mrs. Harding was an attentive hostess, anxious that her guest should feel comfortable, while George had returned from his work at the solicitor's office in unusually high spirits. He was in the midst of describing a particularly complicated inheritance dispute when the conversation was cut short by an odd, hollow sound that seemed to drift through the quiet village lane. It was not loud, but in the hush of twilight it carried distinctly, a dull thud followed by a scraping echo. Miss Marple set down her fork. Did you hear that? Mrs. Harding frowned. It came from outside, surely. George, perhaps the cat knocked something over in the yard. George listened a moment, then shook his head. No, Mother. That came from across the lane. The Whitcomb house. The three sat in silence. The clink of cutlery had ceased, leaving only the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Then, just as suddenly as before, a faint rattle like a sash window being shifted, floated across the lane. Miss Marple, with her usual calm, rose and moved to the dining room window. The view across to the Whitcomb house was clear enough. Its hulking shape stood in silhouette against the fading sky, the shutters closed, the garden overgrown. And there, at the very top floor, the attic window glowed faintly, though no lamp should have been lit within. As Miss Marple watched, a shadow flitted across it. Mrs. Harding gave a little cry. "Jane, did you see?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly, her eyes narrowing behind her spectacles. "I saw." George muttered under his breath, then crossed the room in 3 quick strides to join her. "Good heavens! That attic is supposed to be locked. I've heard so all my life. Mother, hasn't Mrs. Whitcomb always insisted?" "She has," Mrs. Harding replied, her voice strained. "And she's never once allowed anyone to set foot there. Even when she had workmen to repair the roof, she kept the attic sealed." They stood together at the window watching. But after a moment, the faint glow faded. The shadow did not return. The atmosphere at the table never quite recovered. Mrs. Harding tried valiantly to resume conversation, asking George about his day, offering Miss Marple another helping of apple tart, but the words fell flat. Each of them listened unconsciously for further sounds, though none came. At length, George pushed back his chair. "This nonsense has gone on long enough. I shall call on Mrs. Whitcomb in the morning and ask her directly. If there's some vagrant or mischief-maker hiding in her attic, it must be dealt with." Mrs. Harding looked alarmed. "Oh, George, you know how she is. She'll take it as an insult." "Better insulted than harboring a trespasser under her roof," George retorted. "The law is the law, and she cannot." Miss Marple, who had resumed her knitting with quiet determination, interrupted mildly. "Forgive me, George, but in my experience direct confrontations often prove unproductive. People who guard their secrets closely tend to grow defensive when challenged." George gave a huff, but Miss Marple continued serenely, her needles clicking. "It may be better to observe first. Houses, like people, reveal themselves in time. If there is indeed an intruder, a little patience may uncover far more than blunt questioning." Mrs. Harding looked visibly relieved, though she still shuddered. "I dislike the thought of shadows moving about just opposite my windows. It feels so unnatural." Miss Marple gave her a gentle smile. "Oh, not unnatural, my dear. Quite the opposite. Most shadows are cast by very human beings indeed." Later that night, long after the household had retired, Miss Marple once again found herself wakeful. She had never been one to sleep heavily, and the unfamiliar creaks of a strange house often kept her mind alert. She rose, wrapped a shawl about her shoulders, and moved quietly to the guest room window. The lane below lay hushed, the hedges pale in moonlight. The Whitcomb house loomed as always, its blank facade like a silent guardian over secrets untold. She waited. And then there it was again. A movement behind the attic glass. Fleeting but unmistakable. A shadow passing, pausing, then withdrawing. This time she thought she caught the faint outline of a figure, a stooped form as if bent over something. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained calm. She adjusted her spectacles, watching intently. But almost at once the figure vanished. The window remained empty. No light shone now, no sound carried across the lane. Miss Marple remained at the window for a long while after, her knitting lying forgotten on the table beside her. She knew beyond doubt that someone or something was moving about that locked attic. And in her experience, locked rooms rarely kept out trouble. More often they kept it in. Chapter 5. The Whisper from the Rafters. Miss Marple decided to spend the night at the Whitmore estate. It was not usual for her to impose, but she reasoned that proximity to the scene of unease often revealed what polite daytime visits could not. Mrs. Whitmore, though slightly hesitant, was secretly relieved to have Miss Marple's company, and arrangements were made for her to stay in a modest guest room on the second floor. That evening, a storm swept across the village, shaking shutters and drumming rain upon the old slate roof. As the household quieted, Miss Marple sat in her room with a candle on the bedside table, her knitting needles clicking softly. She thought over what she had learned, the fleeting shadow seen at the attic window, the missing documents, and the curious tension that existed between the Whitmores and their long-serving maid, Clara. The patterns of human behavior, Miss Marple reflected, were like stitches in her knitting, tangled if rushed, but perfectly revealing if one had patience to follow them carefully. As midnight approached, the storm lulled, and the great house seemed to exhale in silence. Miss Marple, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, blew out the candle and lay down, determined to rest. But rest did not come easily. Around 1 o'clock she heard the unmistakable creak of floorboards above her, directly under the attic. At first, she thought it might be the old timbers shifting in the wind, but then came something far more curious, a faint whisper. The sound was not words exactly, more like the hushed murmur of someone speaking just beyond comprehension. Miss Marple sat upright in bed, listening intently. Her hearing, though sharp, could not catch the meaning, but she was certain of its origin, the attic rafters. The whispering persisted for a minute, then abruptly stopped, as though silenced by an unseen command. In the morning, over tea, she casually asked Mrs. Whitmore whether anyone had reason to enter the attic during the night. Mrs. Whitmore looked startled and insisted no one ever went up there after dark. It was dusty, unused, and frankly unsettling. Clara, when asked, crossed herself and muttered that the attic was better left alone. Miss Marple noted these reactions with calm interest. Later, while the others were occupied, she slipped quietly toward the narrow staircase that led to the attic. The wooden steps groaned underfoot as she climbed, her candle flickering in the draught. When she reached the top, she paused. The air was heavy with dust, and spiderwebs clung to the rafters like forgotten lace. She moved carefully, her eyes scanning the shadows. Near the far window, the very one where the mysterious shadow had been seen, Miss Marple discovered something curious. On the sill lay a small scrap of paper, crumpled and half-burnt, as though someone had tried to destroy it. She smoothed it gently. It bore only a fragment of handwriting. The inheritance must be hidden. The rest had been lost to flame. At that moment, the whispering sound returned. Soft, lingering, like a breath caught in the rafters. Miss Marple, undeterred, whispered back into the silence. "I hear you, whoever you are." The attic fell utterly still. She pocketed the scrap of paper and descended quietly, her mind now sharper than ever. A shadow in the window, a whisper in the night, and now a clue pointing to an inheritance. The attic was not merely haunted by drafts and old boards, it was haunted by secrets, and Miss Marple was certain someone in the household had much to lose if the truth came to light. Chapter 6. The Attic Window's Secret. The storm had cleared by morning, leaving the village bathed in a pale golden light. Birds sang freely in the hedgerows, but inside the Whitmore estate, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken tension. Miss Marple, refreshed but alert, joined Mrs. Whitmore and Clara at breakfast. Sir Reginald, the master of the house, sat silently at the head of the table, his eyes dark and weary. Conversation was sparse. Mrs. Whitmore fussed about the marmalade. Clara moved about the room with quiet nervousness, and Sir Reginald barely touched his tea. Miss Marple, with her gentle smile and soft-spoken nature, broke the silence. "It is remarkable," she said lightly, "how a storm can uncover things we might not notice otherwise. Doors that rattle, windows that creak, or even shadows cast in the oddest of places." At this, Sir Reginald's fork paused mid-air. He gave her a sharp look before quickly hiding it under a cough. Clara muttered something about needing to fetch more butter and hurried out of the room. Mrs. Whitmore's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her napkin. Miss Marple saw it all, the flickers of guilt, of fear, of secrets carefully guarded. Later, with the morning duties keeping everyone busy, Miss Marple made her way once again to the attic. She carried with her the crumpled scrap of paper she had found the previous night. She wished to see if there were more pieces, perhaps hidden or discarded. The attic, though dusty and neglected, bore signs of recent disturbance. Cobwebs had been brushed aside in certain corners, and faint footprints marred the dust-covered floorboards. Someone had been here quite recently. Miss Marple focused on the window. It was a tall, narrow thing, its glass warped slightly with age, giving it the eerie quality of distorting shadows. She examined the sill more carefully this time and noticed something odd, a latch slightly loose as if tampered with. When she tugged at it, the entire frame shifted slightly, revealing a small hollow space between the inner wall and the wood paneling. Her hands, though delicate, worked with surprising firmness. She pried the panel just enough to slip her fingers inside. Out came a folded packet, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from damp. Opening it, she found several documents, yellowed with age but still legible. They appeared to be property deeds, letters, and an unsealed will. Her eyes narrowed. The name Whitmore appeared throughout, along with notations about land in the village and certain banking accounts. More curiously, one document bore the signature of a man who had supposedly died decades ago, Sir Reginald's uncle, Lord Percival Whitmore. Before she could study further, Miss Marple froze. There it was again, the whisper. Low, insistent, not carried by wind but by intent. She turned quickly, candle held high. The attic seemed empty, shadows crouching in the corners, the rafters still. "Show yourself," she said softly. "I am not easily frightened." No one appeared, but the whisper stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Miss Marple replaced the documents carefully and returned the panel to its place. She would not reveal her discovery yet, not until she knew who among the household could be trusted. Descending the narrow stairs, she nearly collided with Clara, who had been loitering nearby with an expression of strained curiosity. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple," Clara stammered. "I was just fetching linens." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Of course, my dear. Though I must say, it is a curious habit to fetch linens from the attic, when they are always kept in the linen press downstairs." Clara flushed crimson and scurried away. That evening, Miss Marple retired to her guest room early, knitting in hand, but her mind was restless. The documents, the inheritance mentioned in the burnt scrap, the whispering voice, it was all of a piece. Someone in this household had much to gain, or much to lose. As she set her knitting aside, she whispered to herself, "The attic window has seen too much, and now it will tell its tale." And outside, just beyond her window, a shadow lingered once again. Chapter 7. A Family Divided. The next morning dawned bright and deceptively calm, but Miss Marple sensed storm clouds gathering, not in the sky but within the Whitmore household itself. Over breakfast, the tension was unmistakable. Sir Reginald was irritable, pacing the dining room before finally sitting with a huff. Mrs. Whitmore fussed with her teaspoon, clearly avoiding his gaze, and Clara's hands trembled so much that she nearly spilled the teapot. Miss Marple, calm as ever, let the silence work on them. She had long ago learned that silence often compelled people to fill it with their own careless words. And indeed, Sir Reginald broke first. "This nonsense about the attic has gone too far," he barked. "Clara, I forbid you to speak of it again in this house. Do you understand?" Clara's lips tightened, but she nodded. Mrs. Whitmore looked up, startled. "But Reginald, what harm can there be in speaking of shadows? It's nothing more than superstition." Sir Reginald slammed his hand on the table. "Superstition can ruin a reputation just as swiftly as fact. I'll hear no more of it." Miss Marple observed quietly, her eyes twinkling with apparent innocence. She tucked away his words. He was not afraid of shadows but of what they represented. That was quite a different matter. Later that day, she took a quiet stroll with Mrs. Whitmore in the garden, pretending interest in the rose beds. Mrs. Whitmore, relieved to be away from her husband's temper, confided more freely. "You see, Miss Marple," she said in a low voice, "the Whitmore family has history. Old quarrels, disputes over money, land, and even inheritance. Sir Reginald's uncle, Lord Percival, left matters unsettled. My husband prefers not to speak of it, but there were rumors, documents lost, wills destroyed." Miss Marple listened intently. And might those matters still be unresolved? Mrs. Whitmore hesitated, then gave a small, sad nod. "I sometimes think the house itself resents it, that it holds on to secrets." That evening, as dusk settled over the village, an unexpected visitor arrived. Mr. Henry Latham, a distant cousin of the Whitmores. He was tall, thin, with calculating eyes and a polished smile. His arrival threw the household further into unease. Sir Reginald greeted him stiffly, Mrs. Whitmore paled, and Clara nearly dropped the tray she was carrying. Henry Latham explained over a strained supper, that he had been traveling abroad but had returned upon hearing whispers of the Whitmore estate's difficulties. He said it so smoothly that Miss Marple detected the steel beneath his words. "Curious, isn't it?" he remarked, sipping his wine. "An attic shadow, a family inheritance. One might almost believe the dead were restless." His remark caused Mrs. Whitmore to shiver, and even Sir Reginald looked uneasy. Miss Marple, however, only smiled. "Oh, Mr. Latham, the dead are often very quiet. It is the living, I find, who make all the trouble." That night, once again, the whispering in the attic returned. But this time, Miss Marple was not the only one to hear it. Clara came rushing down the stairs in her nightdress, pale as a sheet. "There's someone up there," she cried. Sir Reginald cursed under his breath. Henry Latham looked amused, and Mrs. Whitmore clasped her hands together in fright. But Miss Marple, shawl over her shoulders, simply said, "Well then, perhaps it is time we face the attic together." And with that, the whole household prepared to climb the narrow stairs, unaware that the attic window was about to reveal far more than a mere shadow. Chapter 8. The Night of the Attic Ascent. The old grandfather clock in the hallway struck 11 as the household gathered at the foot of the narrow stairwell. A draught whistled through the corridors, and the candle flames flickered as if protesting the decision to go higher. Sir Reginald, stiff with indignation, led the way with a lantern, muttering about nonsense and hysteria. Mrs. Whitmore clutched her shawl, pale and trembling. Clara, though terrified, trailed close behind Miss Marple, who ascended with the quiet composure of someone who had long ago stopped fearing dark places. Henry Latham, the distant cousin, looked almost eager, as though he hoped to find something incriminating. The stairs groaned under their weight, each step echoing into the silence above. When Sir Reginald threw open the attic door, the smell of dust and disuse rushed down to meet them. The beam of the lantern stretched across rafters heavy with cobwebs, broken trunks, and forgotten furniture shrouded in old sheets. "See," Sir Reginald said sharply. "Nothing but dust and rubbish." But as the others filed in, Clara gasped and pointed toward the far end, where the moonlight streamed through the warped attic window. A dark shape shifted in the corner, then melted away as though it had never been there. Mrs. Whitmore gave a small cry, clinging to her husband's arm. Henry Latham's eyes gleamed with curiosity. Miss Marple, however, stepped forward calmly, her keen gaze sweeping the room. The whisper came again. This time it was clearer, though still faint, like a voice pressed against the fabric of silence. "Hidden, not yours." Clara crossed herself, trembling. "I told you. It's haunted. Haunted by the master's uncle." "Nonsense," Sir Reginald snapped, though his own face was pale. "It's the wind. Nothing but the wind." Miss Marple bent toward the window. Her sharp eyes noticed something peculiar. The pane bore smudges, as though someone's hand had pressed hard against the glass. And below the window, the dust had been disturbed. She crouched, touching the faint marks of shoes in the thick coating of neglect. Someone had been here, alive and very human. "Sir Reginald," she said softly, "I wonder if you would indulge me and shine your lantern here." He reluctantly obeyed, and the light fell upon the wooden floorboards. A small glint caught Miss Marple's eye. She picked it up, a brass key, aged and tarnished. "Ah," she murmured. "And where, I wonder, might this lead?" Henry Latham leaned in, his voice silky. "A key hidden in the attic, documents in the walls. It seems, cousin, that your house has more secrets than you've admitted." Sir Reginald's face darkened. "This is absurd. I will not have my family name dragged into gossip and superstition." Before more could be said, the whisper rose again, this time louder, almost a moan that seemed to come from the very rafters. Mrs. Whitmore screamed, and Clara clutched Miss Marple's arm. The lantern shook in Sir Reginald's hand. But Miss Marple remained perfectly steady. "Calm yourselves," she said firmly. "We are not listening to spirits. We are listening to someone who wishes us to believe in them. Someone who gains by your fear." The whisper stopped instantly. The attic fell into dead silence. Miss Marple slipped the key into her pocket, her mind already piecing together possibilities. Inheritance, lost wills, a shadow in the window, and now a key. These were not the doings of ghosts but of a hand guided by greed. Still, she said nothing more that night. She allowed Sir Reginald to bark orders, Henry to smile knowingly, and Mrs. Whitmore to retire trembling. Clara, however, lingered near Miss Marple's door before bed. "Miss Marple," she whispered, eyes wide, "I know you don't believe in ghosts. But I swear, sometimes when the moon is bright, I've seen him. Lord Percival. Standing at the window, staring down into the garden as though he never left." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on the maid's trembling fingers. "My dear Clara, I assure you, the dead do not return. But the living, when pressed by desperation, can appear quite ghost-like indeed." And that night, as she drifted into light sleep, Miss Marple dreamed not of shadows but of keys, doors, and hidden rooms waiting to be unlocked. Chapter 9. The Brass Keys Puzzle. Miss Marple rose earlier than the rest of the household, slipping from her room with the brass key in her pocket. She had not slept deeply, for the whispers and Clara's trembling confession weighed heavily on her mind. Still, she was calm, her years of experience in observing human nature sharpening her thoughts as neatly as her knitting needles. She tiptoed into the study downstairs, a place she had noted the day before as curiously avoided by both Sir Reginald and Mrs. Whitmore. The heavy curtains kept the room in gloom, and the shelves of ledgers and volumes gave off a musty and used smell. She tried the brass key on the drawers of the great oak desk. None fit. She moved to the tall cabinet in the corner. The lock there resisted at first, but with a firm twist, the key turned. The door creaked open to reveal bundles of yellowed letters, an old ledger, and a small box. Miss Marple lifted the box gently. Inside, cushioned in velvet, lay a ring set with a dull but sizable ruby. A family heirloom, perhaps. More interesting still was the ledger. It contained notations of land transfers, but some pages had been roughly torn out. Before she could examine further, the study door opened. Henry Latham entered, his expression flickering from surprise to curiosity. "Why, Miss Marple," he drawled, "you do rise early. Seeking family history, are you?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Oh, I do like to keep my hands busy in the mornings. Though I must say one can find quite curious things in this house." She slipped the brass key back into her pocket before he could see. Henry approached, pretending nonchalance. "I've long suspected Reginald was concealing documents. You see, my mother always said Percival intended to divide the estate differently. If those papers ever came to light, some fortunes might change." His eyes gleamed. Quite dramatically. Miss Marple gave him a mild look. "And yet you arrive just when shadows and whispers unsettle the household. That seems more than coincidence, does it not?" Henry laughed smoothly. "Coincidence is merely fate with a sense of humor." After he left, Miss Marple replaced the items carefully and locked the cabinet. She did not yet know who the true manipulator was, but she was certain the key was meant to conceal truths, not reveal them. Someone had hidden it in the attic knowing that its discovery would unravel family secrets. Later that morning, Sir Reginald confronted Clara in the hall, his voice raised. "You will stop this talk of spirits, or you'll be dismissed. Do you understand?" Clara, red-eyed and defiant, replied, "I don't care if I lose my place, sir. There's something in this house, something that doesn't want the truth told." She fled before he could strike her. Mrs. Whitmore appeared from the drawing-room, wringing her hands. "Reginald, must you be so cruel? The girl is frightened. The girl is insolent," he snapped. Yet beneath his anger, Miss Marple detected the desperation of a man cornered. That evening, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Whitmore, gently probing. "Tell me, my dear, this uncle, Lord Percival, was his will ever read?" Mrs. Whitmore sighed. "It was said to have been lost. Reginald claimed it never existed, but—" She hesitated. "There were whispers that it favored another branch of the family." "Henry's branch?" Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Whitmore gave a nervous nod. Miss Marple's mind ticked like a well-wound clock. A missing will. A brass key. A ledger with torn pages. Someone was using fear of a ghost to keep others away from the attic, and the truth it concealed. As she retired to her room, she whispered to herself, The dead leave no shadows. Only the living do that. And outside, faintly visible in the moonlight, the attic window once again bore the silhouette of a figure that could not be there. Chapter 10. A Face in the Window. The following night brought with it a deep, unnatural silence. No storm rattled the shutters. No owls hooted from the trees. The Whitmore estate lay still, as though holding its breath. Miss Marple, however, sat awake by her candle, her knitting resting in her lap, eyes fixed on the window opposite her bed. She had long since learned that secrets revealed themselves best when patience outweighed fear. It was near midnight when she saw it again, the shadow in the attic window. But this time it lingered longer. The pale moonlight traced the outline of a human figure, tall and stooped, with one hand pressed against the glass. For a moment it seemed to stare directly at her, though she knew the angle made that impossible. Still, the effect was chilling. Miss Marple rose quietly, wrapped her shawl about her shoulders, and slipped into the corridor. The house was silent except for the faint crackle of the dying fire below. She climbed the narrow stairs toward the attic once more, her candle flickering with each cautious step. When she reached the attic door, she paused. A low sound drifted from within, not quite a whisper this time, but the creak of movement. Someone was there. She opened the door slowly, letting the candlelight spill across the rafters. The attic seemed empty. Yet as she moved closer to the window, she caught it, the faintest reflection of a face on the warped glass. Not her own, not the moon's, but another. She turned sharply, but the rafters revealed nothing. Then, from behind a stack of covered trunks, came a sudden scuffle. Miss Marple stiffened, but before she could move, a figure slipped past her in the dark. The gust of air nearly extinguished her candle, and by the time she turned, the person was gone, fleeing down the narrow stair. Miss Marple did not pursue. She knew well enough that chasing shadows often led to confusion rather than clarity. Instead, she knelt by the window. There, pressed into the dust on the sill, was a handprint, large, unmistakably male and recent. The next morning, she let the family stew in their unease at breakfast. Sir Reginald was red-eyed, his temper short. Mrs. Whitmore was pale and subdued. Clara moved about silently, glancing often toward the ceiling. Henry Latham, however, looked positively pleased, as though events were unfolding to his advantage. At last, Miss Marple spoke gently. "It is curious, is it not, how shadows take on lives of their own? One might almost say they are encouraged to appear, to frighten those who would rather not climb too high or look too closely." Henry gave a knowing smile. "You mean, perhaps, the attic shadow is not a ghost at all?" "Oh no," Miss Marple replied calmly. "It is no ghost. It is flesh and blood, with reason enough to terrify this household, and reason enough to keep that window in use." Sir Reginald's fork clattered against his plate. "Are you suggesting—" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple interrupted mildly, "that someone has been moving through your attic at night. Someone with a very particular purpose. And soon, I dare say, we shall learn whose purpose it is." Mrs. Whitmore gasped. Clara dropped the teapot. Henry Latham's smile thinned. But Miss Marple only sipped her tea, her eyes twinkling. She had drawn the lines of the trap. Now she merely had to wait for someone to step into it. That evening, she resolved to remain awake in the attic, hidden in the shadows herself. For if the figure wished to appear again, it would find her waiting, quiet, watchful, and ready to see the face behind the shadow on the attic window. Chapter 11. The Letter in the Dust. The morning after the storm felt strangely calm, as though the village itself was catching its breath after the chaos. The trees still dripped with rain, the roads were slick, and the houses wore a heavy silence. Miss Marple, however, had risen early. Something in her instincts whispered that the attic still held more secrets, and she was not the sort to ignore a whisper of suspicion. With Reverend Miles's permission, she returned to the old rectory. The attic was darker than she remembered, the air still damp from last night's storm. Dust lay thick on the beams, disturbed only by her careful footsteps. She moved slowly, eyes scanning for the faintest irregularity. Then she saw it, just under the window ledge where the shadow had once loomed, a small patch of disturbed dust. Kneeling down, she brushed it away gently with her handkerchief, and there it was, a folded letter, yellowed with age, its edges curled and brittle. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it, for she knew the attic had not been touched in years. How had this letter surfaced now? The ink was faded but legible. It was addressed simply, "To be opened only in the event of my death." The handwriting was bold, unmistakably masculine. Miss Marple recognized it at once. It belonged to Mr. Samuel Cotterill, the former owner of the rectory, who had died under mysterious circumstances decades ago. Her breath caught as she unfolded the paper. Inside, the words leapt from the page. "If you find this, then I am gone. I fear for my life. I have uncovered what no one must know about the inheritance, about the crime. The one who smiles the most is the one to trust the least. Beware the attic window. Its shadow conceals the truth." Miss Marple's sharp eyes widened. The shadow was not just a recent phenomenon. It had haunted this house long before the present troubles. At that very moment, a creak echoed behind her. She spun around, letter clutched in her hand. Someone was in the attic with her. The air shifted, and she thought she saw movement in the corner. Just a flicker, a presence withdrawing into the shadows. "Who's there?" Her voice was firm, though quiet. No reply came, only silence. Miss Marple held the letter close and slowly made her way down the attic stairs, her mind already racing. This was no ordinary haunting or trick of the light. This was a long-buried secret someone was desperate to keep hidden. And now, with the letter in her possession, she had stepped directly into danger. As she closed the rectory door behind her, she noticed muddy footprints on the stone path outside. Fresh, large, and leading away into the mist. The shadow on the attic window was no longer just a mystery. It was a threat. Chapter 12. Whispers of Inheritance. Miss Marple sat in the quiet comfort of her small sitting room, the newly discovered letter spread out before her on the table. The ticking of the clock was the only sound, steady and insistent, as though it too demanded she untangle the past. She read the letter again and again, each word sinking deeper into her mind. The one who smiles the most is the one to trust the least. Who in this village was hiding behind a smile? And more importantly, what inheritance was Samuel Cotterill referring to? To answer that, she walked down to the parish records, which she knew were meticulously kept. Reverend Miles, though puzzled at her request, gave her full access. She traced the Cotterill family history through births, marriages, and deaths. What she uncovered startled her. Samuel had not died a natural death, as many believed. His passing had been ruled an accident. He had supposedly fallen from the rectory roof while repairing tiles. But the letter suggested otherwise. And when Miss Marple checked the will that followed, she noted something unusual. The majority of his property had passed not to his immediate relatives, but to a distant cousin, Edward Cotterill, who had been living in the village at that time. Edward Cotterill. A man remembered for his charm, his constant cheer, and yes, his smile. Miss Marple pressed her lips tightly. Could it be that Samuel had discovered fraud or foul play concerning the inheritance, and that Edward had silenced him to secure his fortune? Her thoughts were interrupted when Mrs. Hastings, the widow who lived near the rectory, stopped her in the lane. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said breathlessly. "Did you hear? Someone saw a light in the attic window again last night. After you left. Only this time there was a figure moving inside." Miss Marple's mind sharpened. Someone was watching her, perhaps even following her every step. Whoever it was knew she had the letter. That evening she paid a visit to Edward's only surviving relative in the village, his granddaughter Clara, a young woman with a strange smile that never quite reached her eyes. Clara seemed nervous at Miss Marple's polite inquiries about the family's past, and when the letter was mentioned, her hands trembled. "My grandfather. He was a good man," Clara insisted too quickly. "He worked hard for everything he had. People talk, you know, but there's no truth to the rumors." Miss Marple did not press further, but she observed Clara closely. The young woman's words were filled with fear rather than conviction. Later that night, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she thought of the footprints outside the rectory and the faint sound she had heard in the attic. Someone was guarding the truth, and that truth was bound up with Samuel Cotterill's death and the inheritance that followed. She extinguished her lamp, but her thoughts kept her wide awake. The shadow on the attic window was more than just a sinister omen. It was the lingering presence of a crime, one that stretched its cold fingers into the present. And Miss Marple knew, before long, she herself might become a target. Chapter 13. The Hidden Passage. The morning mist clung to the village lanes, curling low over the hedgerows as though it wished to hide the very ground beneath it. Miss Marple, however, had always trusted the ground more than the mist. It held footprints, traces, and truths that people preferred buried. Her mind returned to the fresh muddy prints she had seen outside the rectory door. They had been large, heavy, and deliberate. And so, armed with her walking stick and the determination of one who knew how secrets refused to stay buried, she returned to the rectory grounds. The prints had faded in the night, softened by dew, but she could still see the faint trail leading away from the garden. She followed it carefully, noting how it curved along the hedge and then dipped toward the small copse of trees behind the house. There, concealed beneath a tangle of ivy and nettles, she found what she suspected all along: a half-rotted wooden door, sunk low into the earth. An old servant's entrance to the house? A forgotten cellar? Miss Marple knelt, brushing away leaves, and discovered the door was secured by a rusted iron latch. It resisted at first, then gave way with a groan that seemed to echo far too loudly in the silence. She hesitated, but then, gathering her courage, pushed it open. The smell was of earth and damp stone. She raised her lantern high. Steps led downward into darkness. Her pulse quickened, though her manner remained composed. She descended carefully, the wooden steps creaking beneath her weight, until she found herself in a narrow tunnel of stone. The walls glistened with moisture, and the air was cold enough to sting. She pressed forward. The tunnel twisted, turned, and then climbed upward again until it ended in another door, this one newer, sturdier. Gently, she pressed her ear against it. Silence. She pushed. The door yielded, opening into a space she recognized at once. The attic. Her suspicions were confirmed. There was a secret passage that allowed someone to enter the attic unseen, bypassing the stairs. Whoever had cast the shadow in the window could vanish without ever descending through the rectory itself. Her lantern's glow flickered across the rafters. The space seemed empty. But then she noticed something odd. The floorboards beneath the window had been disturbed, as though someone had recently pried them up. She knelt and tugged at the edge. A loose plank shifted, and beneath it lay a small box wrapped in oilcloth. Hands steady despite her racing heart, Miss Marple opened it. Inside were papers, old deeds, bank notes, and a will that had clearly been rewritten. She scanned the document, her sharp eyes picking out phrases. It left the bulk of Samuel Cotterell's estate to Edward, cutting out the rightful heirs. Fraud. The air behind her stirred suddenly, the faintest sound of breath not her own. She turned sharply, lantern raised. A figure stood at the top of the passage steps, watching her. The lantern light caught only the outline, tall, broad-shouldered, face hidden by shadow. The figure said nothing. Instead, with one swift movement, the door was slammed shut. Miss Marple was left in the attic, clutching the box of damning papers, with the chilling certainty that she had been discovered. Chapter 14. A Face in the Lantern Light. The attic felt suddenly smaller, as though the very air had thickened around Miss Marple. She stood perfectly still, her fingers curled around the box of papers, listening for any sound beyond the door that had just slammed shut. But there was nothing. No footsteps retreating, no creak of the secret passage, only silence. That, she thought grimly, was worse than noise. She set the lantern on the floor and steadied herself. "Well," she murmured softly, "we've played this game before, haven't we? Someone closes the door, and another must find the way out." With a patience born of years of watching life's small puzzles unfold, Miss Marple examined the attic more closely. The window stood only a few feet away, its glass blurred by rain and dust. It overlooked the rectory garden. Though the drop was a dangerous one for anyone less cautious, Miss Marple knew it would serve her purpose if she needed to call for help. She approached it and peered out. To her surprise, a lantern flickered in the garden below. Its holder was moving swiftly toward the churchyard wall. The figure's shoulders were hunched, coat collar turned high. For one brief moment, The lantern glow caught his face. Edward Cotterill. The very man whose name haunted Samuel's letter. Her lips pressed into a thin line. So the smiling air still guarded the attic, just as Samuel had warned. But why now after so many years? The answer must lie in the documents she clutched, the rewritten will, the fraudulent deeds. She tucked the box securely beneath her arm and, with surprising agility, made her way down the ordinary attic stairs. If Edward believed he had trapped her, so much the better. Let him think her frightened and powerless. That was often the quickest way to truth. Downstairs, she encountered Reverend Miles, who looked up from his desk in astonishment. "Miss Marple, I thought you'd left hours ago. You look, well, forgive me, but rather pale." "I dare say I do," she replied briskly. "But I have found something of interest. Tell me, Reverend, do you recall much of Edward Cotterill's history in the village?" The Reverend frowned. "Edward? Oh yes. A genial fellow in his day, always generous at harvest festivals, always with a word of cheer. But—" He hesitated, lowering his voice. There were whispers after Samuel's death. People wondered how the estate fell into his hands so neatly. But whispers are not proof. Miss Marple placed the box gently on the desk, opened it, and slid the will across to him. "Proof, I think, is precisely what we have here." The Reverend's eyes widened as he scanned the papers. Good heavens! If this is genuine, it means Edward forged Samuel's will. "Indeed," Miss Marple said calmly. "And someone has been using that secret passage to the attic to watch for intruders. He was there tonight. I saw him flee across the garden." Reverend Miles paled. "This is dangerous, Miss Marple. If he realizes you have these papers—" She smiled faintly, her knitting bag manner returning. "My dear Reverend, you mustn't look so alarmed. Dangerous people rarely think of elderly ladies as threats. That has often proved most useful to me." Still, she knew Edward Cotterill would not remain in the shadows much longer. He had been seen. His secrets were slipping. And men who had lived on stolen fortune for decades did not surrender quietly. As she left the rectory and walked back toward her lodgings, she felt the weight of unseen eyes on her. The village streets were quiet, but she knew someone was watching. Someone desperate enough to silence her. The shadow on the attic window was no longer a mystery of the past. It was a living danger of the present. Chapter 15. The trap is set. The autumn evening descended quickly, the pale sky turning to a dusky violet as lamps were lit in the cottages of St. Aldhelms. Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting needles clinking steadily, though her thoughts were far from the wool in her hands. She had spent the day turning the problem over and over. Edward Cotterill had motive, means, and now, thanks to the letter and the will, clear evidence against him. But evidence was only half the battle. What remained was the danger of Edward himself. He had been clever enough to guard his family's secret for decades. If he suspected that Miss Marple held proof of his fraud, he would act swiftly. She had seen enough cases to know what desperate men might do when cornered. She rose, placed her knitting aside, and penned a short note which she folded neatly and slipped into her handbag. Then she took up her shawl and walked into the misty streets of the village. Her first stop was the rectory, where she spoke quietly with Reverend Miles. "I believe Edward Cotterill will make a move soon," she told him. "We must be prepared. You will find, Reverend, that men like him are often boldest at night." The Reverend, though visibly nervous, nodded gravely. "What do you mean to do, Miss Marple?" "Why, nothing more than a little housekeeping," she said, her eyes twinkling though her voice was grave. "But I will need a witness or two." By the time she left the rectory, the plan was in motion. That night, Miss Marple deliberately left the curtains of her sitting room unfastened, so that any passer-by could see the lamplight within. On the table, plainly visible, she placed the wooden box of documents she had discovered in the attic. She sat beside it with her knitting, appearing the picture of harmless routine. But on the writing desk nearby, her note, addressed to Inspector Cray, waited, ready to be delivered should anything happen to her. It was near midnight when she heard it, the faint scrape of a latch at the back door. Her knitting needles paused in midair. Her eyes flickered to the window. Yes, there was movement in the darkness. The door creaked open. Heavy footsteps crossed the floorboards. And then Edward Cotterill himself stood in the glow of her lamp, his face pale, his smile stretched thin as a mask. "Miss Marple," he said softly, almost kindly. "Up so late. That box, it belongs to me." She did not flinch. "Belongs to you, Mr. Cotterill? I rather think the law might disagree." His expression darkened. "You're meddling in things you cannot understand. Those papers will ruin everything. My family name, my life. Give them to me, and this will end quietly." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Oh, I do understand, Mr. Cotterill. All too well. Samuel's death, the inheritance, the forged will. It's all there. And now, after all these years, the shadow in the attic window is no ghost. It is you." For a moment, rage flickered across his features, but then he composed himself. He took a step toward her. "You won't live to tell anyone," he whispered. At that instant, the door behind him opened sharply. Reverend Miles and Inspector Cray stepped inside, lanterns raised. Edward froze, caught in the light. Miss Marple's voice was calm, even gentle. "You see, Mr. Cotterill, you were expected. A little trap, nothing more. And you walked straight into it." The inspector moved forward, placing a firm hand on Edward's shoulder. "It's over, Cotterill. You'll come with us." Edward's mask of charm shattered, leaving only bitterness in his eyes as he realized the game was lost. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. Men who smile too much often believe no one notices what lies behind the smile. But one learns to look past appearances, Mr. Cotterill. One always learns.